All right, good afternoon. Welcome everybody, guests in the room and guests on Zoom. I'm Holger Henke. I'm the director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Research at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies. I want to thank all of you for attending. This event is being hosted by SALISES, or has been organized by Sir Arthur Lewis Institute, affectionately known as SALISES. We're part of the Faculty of Social Sciences, but it was important to me to make this an interdisciplinary forum. We are actually here in a room at the Faculty of Medical Sciences, and we also got support from the Faculty of Science and Technology. So I want to thank both deans, Dean Minerva Thame at Medical Sciences and Dean Michael Taylor for providing us various support, including the usage and technology in this room this afternoon. I want to also thank various staff members who are helping us with the technology today. Mr. Richard Leach from SALISES, but also Mr. Kevin Dale and Ms. Brittany Marquise from Medical Sciences faculty who are helping us to keep the technology in control here. SALISES, let me just add, is as you gathered already, a social sciences unit that is engaged both in graduate teaching at the University of the West Indies and in research. And our focus is on development studies. We are offering an online MSc in development studies. And we also offer an MPhil and PhD program in development studies at Mona. We understand development in a broad, holistic way, which does not mean that we address all aspects that may flow into what we consider development, but we try to capture and cover quite a broad spectrum of some of the main aspects of what we consider development. The presentation this afternoon lends itself to, I believe, an interdisciplinary forum, an interdisciplinary discussion. In fact, the title is Biotech for Development, ? And it focuses on Cuba's experience with anti-COVID vaccines and the development of its biotechnology sector. So it's of interest, obviously, also to the medical sciences, I would assume, and certainly to the Faculty of Science and Technology. The presentation will be about 45-50 minutes, and then we're opening up for questions. I encourage our listeners online to type their questions or comments in the chat so I can read it out for the benefit of our presenter and others who are here with us in the room. We can also acknowledge you for verbal contribution if you raise your hand after the presentation. Please note that this Zoom webinar is being recorded and that by participating in it, you are giving your permission for your image or voice to be used as part of this recording. I want to now introduce our speaker this afternoon. He's Dr. Bert Hoffmann, who is joining us on our campus in Kingston, Jamaica, having traveled all the way from Berlin in Germany. We are pleased and proud to welcome Dr. Hoffmann here at the UWI, and indeed to have him as an honorary fellow of our institute. Dr. Hoffmann is a senior researcher at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, GIGA for short. Since last year, he's also the co-director of that institute's Institute for Latin American Studies. He also serves as the head of the GIGA Berlin office, GIGA is based in Hamburg as its main headquarters. Dr. Hoffmann is also an honorary professor at the Freie Universität Berlin, Free University of Berlin, and he holds a doctorate from that same university, summa cum laude, and his work focused back then on the politics of the internet in third world development. His work since then focuses on Latin America and the Caribbean, mainly Cuba, which he has researched and published on for some 20 years. Apart from numerous peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and working papers, he has published 3 books, most recently an edited volume on social policies and institutional reform in post-COVID Cuba. But also before that, on immigrant policies in Latin America and the Caribbean. And a volume exploring Germany's relations with Cuba, especially in education and culture. Dr. Hoffmann is just back from a research field trip to Cuba, and I imagine he may not even have had the chance to present his findings at his institute and his university in Berlin. So this research is brand new and interesting from a number of different perspectives and disciplines. So once again, welcome everybody online and in the room, and those who are just joining us. And welcome Bert as well, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for those kind introductory words by Dr. Henke. Thank you all for attending here in the room and online. It's a really great privilege to be here at the SALISES, and I should probably only add to what Dr. Henke said, that I had the privilege to publish twice in publications of the University of the West Indies Press, so that is part of a longer term, let's say, relation with me with this wonderful institution. So without further ado, let me get started. The structure of my presentation will be briefly Cuba as outlier. Cuba opted for domestic COVID vaccine development, and successfully so, and very few countries did, and even less from the global south. Now I will speak a bit on the background, how that came to be. It didn't came out of the blue. So that's on Cuba's healthcare and the biotech sector, how that has been developed. I will speak a bit about the success of the vaccines, but also of the costs this had, and then I would put forward to discussion what is the title actually of this presentation. Can this biotech sector, or to what extent, or in what conditions, be a motor of development for an island like Cuba? And the questions raised, of course, what does it mean for beyond Cuba also? I mean, what can we learn from that experience? So please jump in anytime you have specific questions, but we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards, and I will be happy to respond as good as I can to that. So let me briefly say the context of this research is I'm from the social science field, but I'm involved in this interdisciplinary project, which is called German Latin American Center for Infection and Epidemiology Research and Training, GLACIA for short. Kind of GLACIA makes us think of other latitudes, but we're basically working with partners in Central America and the Caribbean. The Caribbean is basically Cuba, in Mexico and all other Central American countries, and of course German counterparts. And I call this interdisciplinarity writ large because normally if we speak of interdisciplinarity, it's the social scientists with the political scientists and economists and perhaps anthropologists, and my partners from the medical disciplines. It's a biochemist who's working with medicine, with more close disciplines. And for all of us, it's kind of a great experience to have this interdisciplinarity really stretching beyond that. And that also comes to say to the limits of what I will be able to say. I'm not a chemist, I'm not a medical scientist, And therefore, if you have detailed questions on that, you see the people here, that's the Cuban counterparts who are part of this glacier context. It's the head of the Institute for Vaccine Development, the head of chemistry in Havana University. And if the questions become too detailed, I take them, I send them an email, and they will be much more the persons to be able to respond when it becomes very technical. Having said that, I benefited greatly from the context with these scholars and others in Cuba. However, all judgments, opinions, errors are just mine. No one else is to blame for anyone. So let me speak briefly. What's the background? The Cuban Revolution's healthcare tradition. I think most of you know the key tenets of that. Universal health coverage was what they call the Conquista de Revolución, one of the big achievements of the Cuban Revolution. Universal health coverage. Vaccination campaigns were a central part of that ever since the first days of the revolution. It's this emphasis on preventive medicine. That's why vaccinations are perhaps not of interest to some business companies who rather sell pharmaceuticals, but from a prevention logic, of course, they make a whole lot of sense, and that's why Cuba very early on focused on that. And of course, you have the buildup of broad-based public health institutions across the whole country, and also going to the rural areas where that had been much more absent. In Havana, you had doctors before the revolution, of course, but basically in this capitalistic modus where for the rich and the wealthy, it was easy to have access, but for the poorer and the urban and rural people, much less so. So they had nationwide expansion of hospitals, but also a system of family doctors, of a very broad network of doctors which attend the population at large. And medicine also became a mass university career, to the extent that also many people from Latin America went to Cuba to study medicine, but it's really a very large career at the university. And that also has been part of Cuba's healthcare tradition, what they call medical internationalism, sending doctors abroad, sending nurses abroad, but also having scholarships for people from basically the global south, more Latin American, Caribbean perhaps, but even some scholars from the underprivileged sectors of the United States received scholarships in Cuba on that. And so there's whole schools on that. So that's the big picture, perhaps on the background of that. And now I come to the biotech sector, and here I would stress the term that that was part of a very specific development strategy, which we could call Fidelista strategy, very much by the person at the helm of the revolution, marked by his impetus for good and for bad, you could say. I don't want to judge that at all, but it was Fidel personally who, after some encounters with scientifics, decided that is the way forward for us. We have this big buildup in medical competences, and that is what we can also turn into a big biotech industry. And that began in the early 1980s. That was in the very good days of the Cuban economic situation. The 80s were kind of the best times for Cuba. It was before the fall of the war, before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And they started with project the creation of what is the biggest one of the institutions, the Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology. And you have this little take in Spanish, not that I want to read it to you, but that's from a very recent official news outlet celebrating the anniversary of that. And that emphasizes how much it was a project by Fidel, not by the party, but very much by Fidel. So the first line reads, in his visionary capacity, Fidel knew that the future of Cuba could only be one of sciences. And that is kind of the political framing also in which the sector evolved. And in a very practical sense, you even see it on the bills of the Cuban currency. So in the earlier days, it was Che Guevara cutting sugar cane on the 3 peso bill. Then on the 50 peso bill, in a more recent edition, it was precisely this center. I don't know if you can read it. It reads Center for Genetic Engineering Biotechnology. This building is so emblematic for us. That's the way forward. And that and put it on the dollar bill. I don't think anywhere else, any building of genetic engineering would make it easily on a Jamaican note. I mean, it's a very specific emphasis given to that sector. So that sector persisted, was built up initially, came in the 1980s, but then after 1989, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, all of you kind of know that Cuba fell into a very severe economic crisis because all its trading partners and allies overseas kind of fell apart. And so you had really very severe shortages of everything, but that sector was immune to that. This build-up continued even in those days. So this National Institute of Vaccination developed, named after Finlay, the great medical doctor and Cuban doctor who was the first to find out that yellow fever is transmitted by a vector, by the mosquitoes. So that was really created in 1991. In 1991, there was hardly any gas, anything. It was really a very, very difficult time in all aspects of Cuban life, but that continued, and the big center for molecular immunology was also opened in those years. So in spite of all the problems, the investments in that sector, that was like an island in the economy, and they continued with the hope of turning this into the motor of development. So today it's about 50 institutions and about 10,000 people working there, from the janitors to the medical doctors. On and all, it's a quite, for the island of Cuba, it's by far the biggest concentrated industry of the country, and probably the only one that really has this level of development. So that was an investment fully against the conventional economic wisdom. Conventional wisdom would say that for small countries in the global south, something like this has to go with foreign direct investment. The Soviet take was not that different. The Soviet take was Cuba has to a division of labor, and in that Cuba produces a series of products. Those very sophisticated products either are being produced in the Soviet Union or medicine very much in the German Democratic Republic. But it was not foreseen by the 5-year plans in Moscow that Cuba was to build up its own biotech sector. It was building on Cuba's human capital, yes, but a sector like this has very high import costs. To build up state-of-the-art technology, which Cuba itself does not produce, obviously, they have to import practically all the equipment, and part of that could come from the Soviet countries then, but in the 1990s, nothing came from Soviets anymore, so that had to be paid for in hard currency, which in Cuba is very scarce, as you would imagine. But it was not only an idea of import substituting industrialization. Of course, one idea was to produce medications, pharmaceuticals in Cuba for the domestic use. But that would not have justified such a huge buildup, and it would not have justified the high currency, high cost. But the idea was to export. Now, there's a huge problem with that. One problem, the US embargo or blockade, is whatever you want to call it, the sanctions of the US. So the US market is banned for anything produced in Cuba, with a few exceptions, but basically it's banned. But there's more to it. Beyond the US market being banned, the pharma world market is far from being a free market. There, everything has to go through certification processes before we in Germany can buy any product, it has to be approved by the European and the German medical authorities for use and all of that. And so this whole market is really very much not free, but regulated by essentially state-run agencies, or in some cases, supranational agencies. And into that certification process, welcome. So, and into this certification process, of course, in its language, it's completely neutral. It just raises high standards due to medical, pharmaceutical health concerns. But in fact, a lot of power structures are being built into this certification process. It's dominated by global pharma companies, and it is all made along standards that only big pharma companies can comply with. And I say all, there are exceptions, but by and large, the certification process involves not only the medication in itself, but the whole production line. So if you don't have a production line which is certified, the executes the companies and the cleanliness of every certain production moment, then you will not get the certification to be on at least the Western dominated market. So that is not specifically against Cuba. That would be the same for Jamaica or the same for Madagascar producing that. Actually, it's the same for small European companies too. And you have to basically be a big, deep-pocketed company to have that, or to go into alliance with them, to be associated with them. So for Cuba, on top of that, then come the political implications from the confrontation with the United States, the sanctions regime, and it's not only the US embargo, but it has also certain ways and means to put pressure on third countries too. So that is not an easy picture for the build-up of that sector. And so I say on balance, because that's before I tell the COVID vaccine story, Cuba was able to develop really important medical achievements. They developed certain pharmaceuticals, certain vaccines, which really have been of great scientific and health merit. It moved up the industry was moving up the value chain in terms of what you produce. You don't produce sugar, you produce a much more sophisticated good. But essentially it was reduced to niches in the world market. It could not, you will not find in a German pharmacy any Cuban medical product. And it depended basically on government-to-government contracts, and basically with the global south, at least before the end of the Soviet Union. There was some niches there, but that's a long time ago. So since then, Cuba basically has this medical biotech industry with just that part of the global south which they can reach. And one of the Cuban economists who wrote on that, and it is very, very difficult to get any data and statistics in that regard. And Evaleni, a colleague, recently just said it's been difficult to determine whether the total investment costs have been recovered over time. It is a very, very difficult question since you don't have all the data and the transparency, and then you would have also to calculate from one currency to another, which here is another complication. But that is one of the big tensions in that sector. So now, on that background, I come to the COVID-19 story. I mean, we all are very happy that the pandemic has receded and we sit here without masks or anything. So I understand if you don't want to talk about COVID anymore, but as in hindsight, I think it's a very valuable experience in many ways to what the different societies in the world have done in that regard. And here, Cuba very early on took the decision not to import vaccines. And it's not that they could not have imported vaccines. China would have delivered vaccines to Cuba. I mean, they probably would have had probably Pfizer products, of course, but or Russia would have also sold or donated vaccines to Cuba. It was a decision by the political authorities with the leaders of the medical biotech institutions. Can you do it? Can we rely on you to develop these vaccines? And I think it's a very brave decision by the Cuban scientists to say, yes, we can. Because at that time, that was with a lot of uncertainties and a lot of unknowns. And of course, they had some reasons to assess it, but still we know that quite a few failed and who tried and failed to develop the vaccines. And so that was a crucial moment. And the political institutions then relied on the development of vaccines. We had two different strands with two different institutions. One which turned out to be the vaccine called Abdallah by the SIGBE, that was that institution on the bill you saw, and the other Soberana by that institute you saw with the beginning of my presentation, the Institute for Vaccine Development in cooperation with the University of Havana, who did the chemistry part of it. And both turned out successful. And I would say, I mentioned the US embargo. The US embargo in the COVID crisis became a bit more acute because everybody was running for the same products, which you need to develop COVID vaccines. And there it was so more difficult to feel the pinch of the sanctions. And just to give you an idea, we as German academic institutions work in this project together with the University of Havana. And part of our cooperation with the University of Havana was to bring over equipment, about 200,000 euros in value, so quite some equipment, to help with the buildup of a modern chemistry lab at the University of Havana. That was easier said than done. So even if we, as a German institution, bought equipment, we had, in the end, there was a sign, final destination. The final destination, of course, the University of Havana, and then quite a few of the companies, even not US American companies, but European companies would say, then we cannot sell it to you, because then we might get problems in the US market. And of course, the US market is bigger than the Cuban market. So, so if we have problems to bring over small equipment for the chemistry lab of the university, you can imagine with more sophisticated technology in the moment of the vaccines, there was quite some maneuvering necessary, and a lot of the equipment had to be imported from the Western countries. So they developed those, and they were proved efficient in tests, and they proved efficient in real experience. And that was actually, even for someone without medical specific knowledge, quite easy to see, because contrary to any other country, at least I know, and they had a vaccine process first some functional logic, like first the medical sector, the health sector, the hospitals, the doctors and the nurses, and some others, but then it was by province. So they had one province, and they went through that province, vaccinating everybody who wanted to be vaccinated, and then the next province, and then the next province. And so you could see in the infection rates really this huge difference between the provinces where they vaccinated already and where they were still about to vaccinate. With a 2-week lag, you kind of saw the impact of the vaccines in the statistics with a very easy view without having anything sophisticated to see. They really had vaccines who worked. They vaccinated children from 2 years up. And why did they do that? Why could they do that? Because the vaccines that were developed were basically on, let's call it, old school technology. It was not an RNA, nothing very fancy, new developed as the base. The base was basically the same vaccination process that they had used for 20, 30 years on different vaccination occasions, of course, with the adaptations to the new virus. And that's why they were very kind of certain that the had few side effects and few problems of that sort. It didn't need to have deep freeze storage, nothing of that sort. And so by December 2021, they had 85% fully vaccinated of the population. That is one of the highest rates in the world. It was not compulsory. There was some social peer group pressure. I mean, it was now it's time for this street to get vaccinated and so everybody come out. But if you didn't want to come out, they wouldn't force you to come out. But basically, there's a big, people rather wanted to be vaccinated earlier. That was more the problem. So I'm still with the success story. I will say something on the downsides too. But that success story had a second part to it, medical diplomacy. If you remember that term early on, that came strongly up in the COVID pandemic too. Cuba sent medical brigades to quite a few places in the world to help with the vaccination and the treatment process, including to Europe, including to Bergamo. If you may remember, that was the the European place which provided the most devastating images of hospital collapsing. In Bergamo, there's northern Italy, that's near to Milano, that is not the poor part of neither Italy nor Europe. And you saw the hospital basically collapsing and army tanks carrying out at night the coffins of people. So that were the most shocking images we, at least in Europe, had from the onslaught of the pandemic when it was still very fresh. And that is where Cuba sent medical brigades to, and that became quite highly visible. And some people cried, "Oh, propaganda, propaganda." Of course, there's some propaganda effect to it, but if it you can also call it soft power of a small country. And of course, Cuba was showcasing what it can do best and where it looked good. The word you can use in a friendly or non-friendly tone, it doesn't matter really that much. I think it's the fact remained quite important. And it's not just medical diplomacy, it's also hard currency error that was paid for. That was not just solidarity, but it was an economic agreement. And that is just to follow up on this. That's from 16 January 2024. Italy turns to Cuba to help revive ailing health system. Almost 500 Cuban health workers deployed across Calabria. So that is what is still going on, perhaps in part because it had this symbolic moment where Cuban doctors came to work and help in hospitals. So let's turn to the downside, the Cuban drama in the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is that vaccine production was successful, but was not as fast as everybody had wished for. So there were delays for many reasons. One, the difficulties of getting things in the pandemic, and the embargo, as I said, didn't help, but also for the mere process of really finding the vaccine. It was a complicated process, so it was not ready in time. They had the vaccine in time, but it was not mass production, had not really set in vaccination, had not been started in mass when the Delta wave hit in summer 2020. So at that moment, the Cuban population was still largely unvaccinated, and Cuba has a very old age population. Very different to many, many other parts of the Caribbean, Africa, or the South. And so the hospitals were overrun, which for Cuba, where the health system was one of the big prides of the country, was a very traumatic moment. You had a very specific moment of the health system being overrun, and that was the collapse of the plant that produced medical oxygen. And precisely at that moment they ran it at full capacity, and they ran at full capacity, and then it collapsed, and then could produce anything for more than 2 months. And those 2 months were the months where it was most needed, and that became really the most emblematic part of this overall stress on the Cuban health system. So Cuba did experience an extraordinary high death toll in the pandemic due to those factors: age population, collapse of the health system, and still having a largely unvaccinated population. And the data at the moment were not that clear, but here you see in hindsight the excess mortality. That is how many people died in the summer of 2020 compared to what usually die in the summer of 29, summer of 2018, and the like. And so this excess mortality, which is basically explained by the single factor, the pandemic, and its further effects. So some died not by COVID, but by pneumonia, of course. I mean, all that combines, but this excess mortality rate in Cuba is extraordinarily high. In Latin America, the second highest after Peru. And it's not just a data. If you are in Cuba and speak with people, everybody can tell you, everybody in things like this, but will tell you the story of friends, colleagues, family who died and how terrible it was when the cemeteries also were run over. I mean, it's been a very dramatic moment. So with that, just kind of COVID brought kind of both sides, the glory side and the drama side, together at the very same moment, precisely in those months. The vaccination campaign then started, and then things immediately, immediately after a terrible month, things became much better in terms of coping with the pandemic. But here I have one other important aspect of the downside. So a lot of the resources were concentrated on this vaccine development. And that is an article in the party newspaper by who was then the head of the pharmaceutical industry, who now is Minister of Science. And he said half of the available funds were used for the development and production of COVID-19 vaccines, which meant yet only half of the funds needed to purchase the necessary inputs for the set of basic medicines. So since then, Cuba has a shortage of the basic medicines it produced, in part because of the general shortage of things and of the tourism broke down, so the income from tourism and all that, which you can imagine, which happened in the pandemic to a very tourism-dependent country. But it was this decision to develop vaccines, which of course had costs, and part of the costs were really that they could not produce the medicines they needed for many other things, which also explains high mortality then by people who just didn't get the medicine they used to have against high blood pressure, whatever it is. And all this comes in the midst of a very profound economic and social crisis. We had crisis before. Actually, you could say that since '89, Cuba was moving in different phases of crisis, with better times and less good times. But the pandemic meant that tourism came to a complete standstill, basically, and everything which had to be transported came to a complete standstill, and the domestic industry really didn't produce much, which reflects in, I just make it very brief here, just to have in mind that this sector plays out in a very specific context. I got the migration data for those years compared with what was the Balsero crisis. Maybe some remember 1994, the moment of the most profound crisis after '89. There was a string of Cubans leaving the island on desperate balsas, which is embarkations, improvised embarkations or whatever sort, which made a lot of media coverage. So that was about 35,000 people who left that year. In 2022, alone to the US, it was 200 20,000, 30,000. And we have the data for the US so well because they register whoever is still in Panama. I mean, we don't know, we don't have the data, but it's huge. Out migration has surged tremendously, and also inflation has become dramatic. Just to give you that idea, the average salary in Cuba by now translates into $20 US per month. And even the scientists and the chemists who work at the university don't earn much more than as their state salary, because the peso has been so devalued. So in this overall crisis, is it what we play out? And we can come to that later in the discussions. I just want to mention it briefly here. So the Cuba's COVID-19 vaccines are based on existing old school, we want technology, proven technology, much experience, few side effects, easy storage, easy application, suited for children 2+ years, suited for boosters. It showed its efficiency, but it got no WHO approval for a number of reasons: lack of international publications in those peer-reviewed journals they should have that are rigid, but also for not getting the production sites approved. It is not the end product, but the whole production process of it. So again, we are with the same. We have okay. So why no approval? Cuba has not been able to get all the data in line with the what's needed for that. There was certainly US political interference too, but the key thing really is not the question of the efficacy, but the production process had to be certified. And the Institute of Finlay de Vacunas, the Vaccine Development Institute, they tell me our production sites are from the 1990s. There's no way we're going to get them certified. I mean, the electricity wiring would not get certified. The fire system would not get certified. There's no way to get a production site. It does everything perfectly well, but you wouldn't be able to cope with it, those standards. The Abdallah, probably easier, it's a newer institution. So there is again this question, is it legitimate concerns over the quality of the vaccines? We all want to have medical products that are quality controlled, of course, or how much is it really protectionism by the global pharma companies? So as to commercialization, the COVID vaccines again depended, like everything else before, on government arrangements, which could sidestep those WHO concerns, or what was required to enter Germany or the US in terms of. So there was co-production with Iran. Iran has its own COVID vaccine by name. It's the Cuban vaccine being produced in Iran. It's a long-standing cooperation between those sectors with the Institut Pasteur and Tehran. You had donations / exports. It's not always easy to tell because of the negotiations behind of Cuban vaccines to Vietnam, to Syria, to Venezuela, to Nicaragua, to Mexico. Except for Mexico, which is a bit apart, the others tell you that they are out of the normal circuit of the global capitalist-dominated world and follow other standards. China didn't import anything because they have their own vaccines, so it depended on those issues too. And there was no access to world market. There was no vaccine tourism, what Cuba had hoped for. Initially, they even put out a video at a certain moment. Come to Cuba, have your holiday here, get vaccinated, and go home. Why didn't that work? Because it wouldn't have helped me at all, the Cuban vaccine. Our Cuban colleague, who is one of the fathers of the Soberana vaccine, to come to Germany, and he works in Germany 3 months, 6 months a year in our project. He had to get on top of it 3 Cuban vaccines, 3 Germany-approved vaccines to be able to work there. So So no tourism would make sense because people didn't want to get the vaccine only to be safe against the COVID, but also to be able to enter wherever they wanted to enter. So Cuba had no vaccine tourism, and the big hope then was to have it as a need for vaccination of children, because that is really where other vaccines are not approved for or more complicated. There was even plans for joint production in Italy. That is one of the logics. How can we get into the European market? Well, by having our product produced in Italy. But then, as you all kind of know, it was a race against time. By now, the demand for COVID vaccines is way down, and the global vaccine supply is up in the skies. So if things would have turned out differently, and who would have known 4 years ago, and it would have become standard once a year, you have to get vaccinated, this would have been maybe really a very great currency earning possibility for Cuba if, say, the United Nations would take the Cuban vaccine to vaccinate children all over the world, bang, then. But this didn't turn out. And by now, Cuba's vaccines are as much in low demand as vaccines against COVID by anybody else. So what can we make of this in the wider picture? And that's why I come to an end with the presentation. Yes, impressive scientific and medical successes under very difficult circumstances in many ways, but the economic gains were, there were some, they did export some, but they were quite limited, and it stabilized this high-tech sector. The companies or institutions there have some autonomy. They got income revenues from, say, they deal with Iran, say they export to, so the Institute of Finlay Vacunas, for instance, could get new audiovisual equipment. They could invest in things they needed to invest. They could put on top of the salaries, which are completely depressed in Cuba, as I mentioned, real bonus payments from those revenues, which really made a big difference. We're speaking of bonuses that are way more higher than the salary. It's not 10%, but it's 1,000% or whatever in terms of bonus in those days. So that certainly is an asset, and it put, and I think that's not to be underestimated, Cuba as on the global map of, hey, that's a country where they produce high-tech things in the sector, and not everybody would have it on that map. And that translates into the hope to have other products they're developing. Currently, it's dengue, Parkinson's, cancer. They have other products in development, and the hope to be on the global map of potential producers there. It had high investment costs. Okay, and commercialization may improve with larger non-Western markets if those markets that do not follow those certifications procedures become more important. And China certainly is a market that is big, only that's producing a lot by itself, but other markets in the global south may also become growing markets for Cuban products. But it still has very high investment costs. To keep this high technology up, you really have to invest almost every year. It's a very fast-moving sector, and they will continue to have this problem of brain drain with the salaries they have. I mean, even with the best day of bonus payments, the people would earn much more in Switzerland, United States, or wherever. And if they're as good as they are, they have other options to go to work for. And now, with no revenues coming in from the vaccines, even those bonus payments are not there anymore. And even in the very qualified sectors, we have a huge problem of brain drain. My colleague from the University of Havana, he one of the fathers of the Soberana vaccine, so quite a figure in Cuba. And they were heroes, national science heroes of the year and whatnot. he once put up a Facebook post and said, Cuban science is screaming, I'm not preparing chemists anymore, I'm preparing immigrants. Putting it bluntly, it's not the only country that has got this problem, of course, but in Cuba it plays out very strongly as the currency in the country is so depressed. So that sector is important. It's not a magic bullet for Cuba's economy. It has, as anything, its upsides and downsides. And in essence, the idea of having this island of efficiency, that was the old Fidelista idea we have this biotech sector here, which gets everything, even if we have other sectors where that is not really sustainable if the overall economy of the island doesn't recover and you balance things out a bit between the sectors. And that, of course, now leads to a whole different discussion, which would make for another conference. But I would leave it at that for the moment. We have time for questions and answers. I think it was kind of 45 minutes as you had planned. And I hope it was of some interest to you. And thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, thank you, Bert, for that far-ranging presentation. And we welcome comments and questions. I said online, if you want to write them into the chat, we can read them out here. You can also raise your hand if you prefer that. And we try to have you speak up here in the room. And then maybe I start if there are any questions in the room. I know we have on Zoom certainly, and also in the room, there's quite a diversity of disciplines. We have political scientists, we have economists, we have marine scientists, students. I know online there's biotechnology and others that I'm not recognizing necessarily. And so, as I said at the outset, this is potentially a very interdisciplinary conversation, as it should be. And so I think I saw one hand in the room, so I'm going to yield the floor to that person. If you can also mention maybe your names before your comment, question, and maybe your affiliation as well. Thanks.
I'm William Erwin from CCRIB, so biochemistry background. I just wanted to ask, do you have any insight as to why India doesn't face this kind of hindrance to get into the global pharmaceutical market? Because I know they have such a large share of that market.
Should I answer directly? Okay. Well, for one, India really has a huge market and also companies big enough and capital strong enough to fulfill a lot of those certification necessities. Still, we had, even in the COVID pandemic, one incident which was kind of an uproar in India when the AstraZeneca vaccine, when the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was British and India produced as well as in India, a distinction was made that it was only the Britain-produced vaccine which got the certification and not the India-produced vaccine, although it's the same vaccine by recipe, but of course not what I mentioned, the production sites. In the production sites, there some inspection had failed or was not in time or whatever they found, and I don't know the specifics of that case, but the problem was the production side. And that's why only the Britain-made Astra was, and of course the Indians rightly, I guess, felt that there is some, what would you say, well, I mean, the colonial legacy played out, hidden under seemingly objective figures. Of course, it was some technicality, but of course it had to do with the disparities. I think that was resolved and India managed to have Indian AstraZeneca produced vaccines being accepted in Europe and elsewhere. But that is one instance where this did happen. So I don't know exactly how in general for India it plays on each and every case, but by and large, the normal Indian, the big Indian production sites have passed through those certification processes and then thus are able to get onto the world market.
Yeah, I do remember that it happened in Serum Institute, and I think it was a factor here with getting visas for the US as well.
Yeah.
Right.
So with all the pros and cons to, I'm sorry, I'm the 100th guy, I'm from CCRP as well. Right, so with all the pros and cons, you know, that Cuba experience, you think that they will do this again. So you have another, would they create another vaccine given all that's happened with this previous one, with that vaccine that they made?
I mean, that's a bit the question of, in hindsight, with all we know, of course, we all would have done certain things different. And with all they know, they wouldn't have put out the video for vaccine tourism. Of course not. But basically, I think they would try to take the chance to put their biotech sector in function of fighting the pandemic domestically, but they clearly also did it with an eye on having an export opportunity there. And you act under a lot of uncertainty inherently in the process. I mean, back then when that decision was made, neither them nor anybody knew what the future mutations of the virus would be. It could have been that the vaccines never turned out to be efficient. Neither theirs nor anybody else's. I mean, you act under high levels of uncertainty. And so it is a brave decision to say, yes, we can get this done. And they would probably not say that was a wrong decision. I don't think anybody in Cuba said that was a wrong decision. It turned out successful in the development, and that you have a whole lot of other problems coming up. Wouldn't probably undo that decision. But I'm not the one who took the decision, I'm the one who will take it next time, so you have to ask other people on that.
Just a follow-up question from that. I'm looking at that from the Caribbean Center for Research in Biosciences, which was formerly Biotechnology Center and Natural Products Institute.
Okay.
So it seemed like, I mean, one of the hardest things the world was battling with was to come up with a vaccine, to understand the science behind it, and Cuba did amazing by actually using one of the more traditional methods of preparing it versus the more RNA-based thing. So it's not the science that held them back, but it seems to me from what you're saying is more the production side quality that let them not make it exportable item. And to me as a scientist, it seems like it's the lesser easy, I mean, it's a lesser harder thing that they failed at. Yet they got the science right, they came up with something very brilliant and effective. And yet to do it in mass scale, to get it into that safety zone of being able to open your lab to somebody and saying, we're producing it in a safe manner. And it was safe enough for Cuban people, I think it's safe enough for anybody. Perhaps the transport issue is what needs to be taken into. And so to me, one of the biggest lessons going forward would be, I think, get it produced, but can we do it mass level into a way that the world can accept it? Is Cuba willing to accept that, and will they put infrastructure into the production level, so biotechnological advancements going forward?
Okay, so first I completely agree that it was a huge feat in the science and medical huge achievement. I wouldn't underestimate the commercialization issue, not just production in the sense of putting the machinery and the inputs into place. It's the commercialization side. And that is where I say there are a lot of power structures built into that process. And these are not easy to sideline. And let me take the example of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. So Pfizer didn't develop anything. They bought the BioNTech product, and which is a German, a very small German, almost startup company, if you say. It was not a big pharma company, BioNTech. And they developed this vaccine, and they partnered with Pfizer for the global distribution of it. And of course, why did they do it? Because they wouldn't have been able to do that. So when the deals were done, Pfizer sent 100 lawyers into the negotiation with the European Union. I mean, who's got 100 lawyers specialized in medical things? I mean, it's a lot of really tough power structures in the commercial world, which obliged BioNTech not to make all the money itself, but to partner with Pfizer, who got that is the case for that. And that's the same for Cuba. And that's why the idea to develop it in the production site in Italy would have been one of the lessons they took from that process. It's not that they say our production sites are per se not good enough, but we may be right, but if we don't get the certification, then what use is it for us to be right? It's like having a car accident and it says, well, but he was right, and that's what they chisel on his tombstone. I mean, it doesn't help to be right. You have to make the money if you have to make the money. So I think the commercialization side really is a tough one and very difficult for small players. And if you're not only a small player, but also Socialist Cuba, who has got political headwinds from the US and other places, then it's all more difficult. So don't underestimate that side. It's not just having a production side.
Second question.
Yeah, sure. Okay, go ahead. Then we have one that was here, and another one in the back of the room. I'm not seeing anybody online asking or making comments, so we stay with the room here for now. So go ahead.
Was the uptake associated with the fact that this was more older technology with the people, uptake of the vaccine? And then I know that, I mean, we study natural products in Jamaica. We have a very strong intermedical practice here in Jamaica, as much as varies or more in Cuba. What were people's, appeal towards a vaccine, given the reliance on natural products and on the medical treatments?
I would say that Cuba is a bit a case apart in that. Cuba has a strong track record since at least the revolution and the alliance with the Soviet Union, GDR, and the like, on a strong development of medication, standard Western, whatever you want to call it, medication. And so there is some traditional medicine also in Cuba, but it is not as widespread as elsewhere in the Caribbean. It's a strong belief, and I go to my family doctor and he knows what's good for me. And it's a practice where I wouldn't call it trust. It doesn't have to do with trust in the state, in the political sense, but in the health sector. And that is also with the vaccination. If that the normal people wouldn't really care for what exactly vaccination type was behind it, but that is, if my doctor tells me, then I follow more or less. I mean, I'm sketching with a very broad brush here, but basically as a positive attitude towards the prescription medicine. I personally was surprised that, because I had thought that the whole anti-vaxxer movement in the US is so strong, and the Cuban Americans in the US have become so much on the Trump side of things. And I would have imagined that from there, a lot of contact, everybody, good family on the other side of the States, I would have thought that a lot of anti-vax sentiment would come via telephone, via WhatsApp and all that. The onslaught of the Delta virus at that moment, really seeing everybody knew some of the older folks being in very critical state or having died. That, of course, had a strong impetus in saying, well, get vaccinated.
Okay. Let me go with the gentleman in the back. So we have a diversity of voices, and then you had your hand up for a while, and then we have one more in the back as well. So,
okay, thanks for it. Was the first language in this except philosophy. So very biotech. I wanted to ask about the initial, I'm not sure if I should use capital in relation to Cuba, but whatever funds and resources were pumped in, and what was the source. But I think I can already guess for the labor, if you're paying $20 a month, the labor costs are not that bad. But it dawned on me how much expectations, in individual societies will drive that. So they probably have a labor bill that is, millions of dollars high in one country, but then in Cuba, it's significantly lower. And I'm asking because I did ask a medical professional in Jamaica while the pandemic was going on, why is Jamaica creating its own vaccine? Cuba is creating theirs. And they said, oh, but it's so expensive. If Cuba can afford to, then why? Which is why I'm curious about what sort of capital
Very good question.
does this require?
And I can take it further if you like. I personally am really appalled by the incapacity of our big pharma companies in Europe not to develop vaccines. We have to expire sharing and the like in Europe, and the French and the Japanese are neither, the Swiss neither. The only European company was AstraZeneca that successfully developed vaccine. All the others didn't. And we have this pandemic, and we have a huge sector, deep-pocketed companies, and they fail to be up to the task. So why is that? To a good extent, because they didn't care much about vaccines. They let India do the vaccine stuff. That's for the masses, that's large quantities of cheap products once you have developed it. It's a mass market. You make much more money with medication for specialized cancer treatment, whatever. So it's a mindset of an industry, and also the technological infrastructure you have. You need to have a certain vaccination production infrastructure and workforce and specialists and engineers and chemists who have a certain vaccination affinity. Of course, you can learn everything and retrain and rebuild, but if you are only working for, let's say cancer treatment, or Brazil has got a huge medical expertise in beauty. Probably a colleague in the medical sciences was right to build it up from scratch would, and all the more in a race against time. because it's then it wouldn't be very effective, I suppose, if you don't strike a super lucky streak. Once you have the vaccination infrastructure and the people to work it, then it still is costly, and that's what I said. The sector really depends on a lot of products that you can only buy from one specific producer. So we have this centrifuge, is that in English or not? This machinery, and only one product fits into that, and you have to buy it from the same company that you bought. So you've got a lot of dependency built into the equipment. And of course, in a moment like the pandemic, everybody is searching for the same products, and it becomes very expensive, but it's expensive per se, and to keep it at this state of art. But is that more or less an answer?
Yes.
So my question was a follow-up to Deondra's, and I was going to bring up the Pfizer example, but these questions kind of brought it back full circle. In this case, where because it was a pandemic and it was such an emergent situation, and you had so much subsidization with respect to the vaccines that were produced elsewhere, the R&D costs weren't as offset as if you were to import them, if that makes sense. The disparity between the R&D cost of developing your own vaccine versus importing it wouldn't have been so offset if it wasn't so subsidized to try and get the vaccine everywhere around the world. So in a case where you have a situation where you're trying to develop a vaccine for something that's not so emergent or not a pandemic, I think Cuba might be better off in that regard as opposed to importing.
Yes, the argument is completely true. However, better is a statement that refers to good, and it's never good for Cuba.
Okay.
So it's less bad.
Yes.
And because Cuba really has a liquidity crunch in hard currency that is structural and severe, and even in a situation where you buy products that are not on worldwide demand, let's take dengue. I mean, it's not, we don't have a global dengue pandemic. We have a specific problem in certain regions of the world, and that. So, but even there, you have to buy on the world market certain equipment products, and that for Cuba is extremely costly.
There was a question in the back, and somebody online had added, and their strong public health system. I think that was to your comment about having that vaccination tradition as part of a precondition to develop the industry.
Probably that came late to the presentation. I had a whole slide at the beginning,
yes,
emphasizing
yes,
public health.
You had, you did, yes. So,
my name is Alice. I'm visiting the University of Sussex for some field work, and this is not my field. So I might be a naive question, but it relates to also. I'm sorry, so you may have had this when I was not here yet. But it relates to the question of intellectual property in this process, and what role does that play in this vaccine? And it's not my field, but my limited understanding is that there was a WTO that's a patent waiver on the COVID-19 vaccine, but I believe that has been a problem for the lower and the American countries, so that they cannot then use that as an asset. It may be good at this one, but I'd just be interested to hear anything you have to say about intellectual property and how that might correlate with wider sense of vaccine apartheid and exploration.
Okay, I hope I understood it correctly. So intellectual property rights are a sacred cow in a capitalist world market, and they have also been so in the pandemic. And I think my take is that there should have been, even without challenge the whole system of intellectual property rights, which of course we might want to do for other reasons, but that may not be very immediate to solve. There should have been a waiver in a situation of world emergency as we have. And that didn't materialize because of the interest that stood against it by, of course, those who hold the property rights, but also those who didn't want to have a case on that. However, the property rights issue alone would not have really had such a practical effect in terms of it. And I don't want to misunderstand. I think it's a complete right claim to make. But I just want to say in the mRNA technologies, to build up a lab and the knowledge and the deep freeze functions, all of that, if you do that from scratch, the pandemic is over before you have it. Just as simple as that. It would take more time than that, given the pandemic. Which doesn't mean that I think the claim was wrong. I would just say it's not, it would have been the magic bullet in that situation either. I think it would have needed an impetus of distribution of all those who can produce, and that has to be pooled and has to be distributed or whatever, this type of thing. Of course, that's a bit utopian, I know, but that is one of the issues. Cuba sided with the claims to free intellectual property rights from that. However, of course, they want to keep the patents on their products too. And let's say if all patents would have given freedom, they would have probably liberated theirs too, but that would not come about to happen. So it's easy to say that. At present, of course, Cuba is proud to get remuneration for their patents by selling vaccines. That also is a very logical step if you develop that. So if everybody frees it, then you're a different ballgame. But in that, you are not. So.
Thank you. I guess I was just wondering, this whole utopian idea.
Can you speak up a little bit? I think people online, or come here to the microphone, if you would.
Thank you, that helped me understand. I guess I was just wondering how their methodology in particular, and given that you say it was developed through more old school methods, for want of a better phrase, how that could then be maybe not sold in the capitalist model, but redistributed for countries of a similar nature. And what role would the restrictions around intellectual property play there? But that's another debate, so you don't need to answer that. But yeah, thank you.
There's another question.
Yeah, Mark Figueroa. I'm an economist and a social scientist. Can hear me as usual. Yes, I would just add though to the intellectual property thing. There are a number of countries that could have benefited. There are very few because they have the infrastructure. India would have been one, China would have been another, and maybe Iran, and maybe some of the European countries like France, and maybe Italy and Germany. But the people thought could, people were talking about it. South Africa was a good benefit, or Nigeria, or probably maybe Brazil could have, but beyond that very small group. But in the case of India and China, they so quickly because they had that technology and they could convert it to COVID very quickly. The Chinese used a different route and converted it quickly, and the Cubans used a different very quickly. But each of those three groups have this long history of bad technology and have the production capacity or could create the production capacity in the case of countries like China especially, but also India. So that, but some people just think that, that you get rid of the patent, you have a technology, and then you go down the road and make the thing, but it's...
Do you know if any of those technologies are still patented? They've been around for a while, and I know in the pharmaceutical industry, patents run out for a certain period of time. So the adenovirus base that's used to make the AstraZeneca, and I presume the old school Cuban one, the mRNA technology and the DNA technology are any of those two patented as a means of making vaccines?
No, but that's not what people wanted them to let go, you know. It was to let go the vaccine itself, not the technique.
Right.
But it's to allow people, anybody who could produce the AstraZeneca vaccine, they should have been allowed to produce it. But the problem was, even if they had let them do it, just India who would have done it, but not Nigeria.
But then the question also is, who is India?
What?
Who is India? Is it one company in India?
Yeah.
And the Serum Institute did produce AstraZeneca.
Yeah.
So again, it's
Yes, but the point is, when Europeans and Americans were not allowing anybody to buy vaccines against themselves, the Chinese were sending them all over the world. The Russians were sending them to the Caribbean. Indians were sending them to the Caribbean. So that if the Russians, the Indians, and the Chinese could have got their hands on those vaccines, it would have made a big difference. Because the American European first policy excludes the rest of us.
that is, I think, what I meant with the distribution. It would have needed a very, very different distributive mindset for all vaccines in a way to just follow the health logic. And I mean, you mentioned the Chinese and the Indian. There also were non-health issues considered. So India donated vaccines also with a certain idea of getting geopolitical clout, and China, Russia,
The Americans and the Europeans would be doing it. So we're happy for the Russians.
I completely agree, and I think that was a very, very much turning point in the European and US kind of credibility in terms of having the interest of the world in mind. That was very clearly not the case, or at least on a second priority. We had those other initiatives, COVAX and all that existed, but it was on the back burner and it was not the first priority. And just one thing I would add, that it's not the same to equate this one with India, country with company. So BioNTech is a German company, but it's not Germany. And Germany was not the first country to receive BioNTech vaccine. That was Israel, because the company BioNTech made a deal with Israel, and they had acted as a company, not as Germany. And so that's just the one thing I would say is different about the logic of a capitalist company within a country, where I would say that the Chinese still the general attitude in all Western countries was a domestic logic pressured by their own populations. I mean, it's not just for being evil. I mean, people said, I voted for this country, this government, and I want them to deliver. Why am I still waiting for my vaccine? And I want it to be faster. And there was some domestic pressure, obviously. And the world pressure didn't translate into the votes you depend on for your re-election. So there's political logic, not because they were evil necessarily, but because the whole logic of politicians is not to do good for the world, but to keep the constituents happy, to keep the industry happy, and all that. But it's a big failure of the West. For me, the COVID pandemic is a big failure of the West, of the Western companies, and of the Western model of confronting the crisis.
There's a follow-up question online. He says, next week I'm back in Toronto and I would be better able to follow up with you then. My questions will focus on CMO Oh, he's asking if he can follow up with you afterwards. My questions will focus on CMO and CDMO, biopharma, biologics, manufacturing in Jamaica and the Caribbean, and not start with a focus on basic research and vaccine innovation. To me, basic research is high risk, high reward. CMO is low risk, good growth, and high rewards. Your thoughts? Let's chat soon. So he wants to take this offline, maybe, or if you want
Okay,
to answer to
let me
this
just
now.
take it. Anybody who wants to follow up with me on things can contact me by email or any other way. You're welcome to do so. Again, I have to say, I'm not from the medical field. I will not be able probably to answer all the questions you have in that regard, but please feel free.
Was from Michael Lopez. I'd be ready to, we're sort of winding down, it seems. I'd be prepared to have another question online, offline. As you think about that, my curiosity really was, development is hardly ever the result of a sort of silver bullet, one product or raw material. And I think that's even true for something like oil. If you look at Venezuela, even some of the Arab states were producing it. But I'm curious, you sort of started to talk about it during your presentation about possible spin-offs of this, what could be rightfully seen as a proof of Cuba's biotechnology capabilities. Is there a renewed or a new interest in looking at Cuba as a potential platform for developing future products along those lines, or even actually producing them there if one were to invest? And that goes with the question earlier from Joseph, maybe also with regard to having a certain competitive advantage in terms of the labor costs, at least.
Yes, I said that the big success of the COVID vaccines put Cuba on a global map of potential producer of such a specific product nobody else or few else were able to produce. And that is something what they want to capitalize on. I think they can. And we have certain initiatives now with dengue. They are working on something that even is one joint venture with a US company, which despite the embargo, there's this one joint venture with a US company, and that was recently in Cuba, was received by the president and all that. And that has to do with its recognition of a certain capacity Cuba has. The problems I tried to show will be still there. And there are ways to overcome it by association, perhaps, and this producing with somebody else, and the like, which of course has its own downside because it's a bargaining. How strong is the bargaining position in such a move? And I also put in deliberately the slide of the Cubans in Calabria now, the Cuban doctors in Calabria, which also has got this spin-off effect. Cuba is a medical power. Cuba is sometimes the biotech sector, but that's part of this health sector, which they try to turn into hard currency earners too, not just the pride of the country, but also to make money, which they definitely need. So yes, it can have those spin-offs. In each and every occasion, it has to materialize. They must get this dengue vaccine medically sound. They have to get someone to commercialize it with. So all the steps have to. They can always succeed or fail in every instance. It's nothing, but it's a very worthwhile hope to have. And if things work out, it really is an excellent sector in terms of keeping high human capital, highly skilled labor in place, developing, technology, not just adapting, all those issues you would want to see from a development perspective to happen. Only that they have to resolve the rest of the economy too, because it will affect, because also those 10,000 workers have to have a transport to their workplace. They also, when they come home, they want to have light and air conditioning. If you have blackouts 8 hours a day, that will not help. I mean, it's very, very difficult to have this sector as an enclave isolated from the rest of the economy. That will be a difficult stretch to maintain at the time. So it will depend a lot, really, I would say, on the overall development. And you said rightly, hardly anywhere it's a silver bullet. It was very much this feudalista hope to have one sector as a magic bullet. That was in 1970, it was all go to the Safra, the sugar harvest of the 10 million, the record sugar harvest, that would become the mode of development. That's when the Che bill became so emblematic. Then it became the international tourism, the kind of way the idea was to keep a socialist economy intact, separate from whatever happens in the Varadero resorts, which also had some development effects, but not the full effects. You cannot only develop one sector with the other side being completely detached. And this idea, I think, is still very strong in Cuba to hope for this will be the sector. We invest everything there, we will become great there, we strike a gold mine in a way, and then we don't really have to tackle the difficult task to make the social
Thank you very much, Bert, and the audience both in the room and online. There's some thank yous that are coming in from online as well. Pleased to have you here this afternoon. I hope you learned something and have some ideas for further conversation. Put Dr. Hoffmann's email in the chat, and I'm sure he'll entertain questions and comments offline. And my own email is in there as well, if you feel like that's useful. So thanks again, and wish you a good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you from my side once again for coming here, for hosting me to be at the UWI. It was a big pleasure. Thank you for the questions, and thank you all for joining. Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you. I also want to use the opportunity as we're parting here to announce our SALISES conference, annual conference on May 1 to 3 this year at the campus, Mona campus, regional headquarters. I put the poster for the event in the chat. If anybody wants to download, it was at the very beginning of the chat. It's also online on our website at SALISES. So please feel free to explore that if that's of interest to you. Thank you again. Good afternoon. Bye-bye.